Hey everyone, my name is Jon Lowry, and I'm a graduate of University of Valley Forge. Graduated in 2004. While I was there, I studied music, and piano was actually my primary instrument. Voice was my secondary. But today, I wanted to talk about the bass guitar. When I tried out for the traveling worship teams at the school, I discovered that there were about 1,000 guitar players and 1,000 keyboard players, but only just a couple bass players trying out. So I was like, well, that's my ticket in. So I switched over and had an old Schecter California custom bass guitar. It's actually this one. This was my first bass. And so I brought this thing to school and ended up making the team. Well, right before graduating in late 2003, I went up back home to Maine for Christmas break. And I got together with an old buddy, Chad, and a friend that he had brought back from the Dominican Republic named Mike. Mike was a guitar player. Chad played guitar a little bit and sang. And so I started playing piano with them. As time progressed, we ended up getting a drummer and really needed a bass player rather than a piano player. So I switched from piano back to bass guitar. And I've been essentially playing bass guitar with that band Unspoken now for the last 18 years. Everything else is fun to play, but there's something about bass. It's just, they call it driving the bus. You have so much control over the dynamic of where the song is going. You know, playing the bass is similar to being a sound engineer, I would say, in that nobody really notices you until you mess up. And then, you know, if there's feedback, everybody looks back at the soundboard. Similar to the bass player, nobody's really watching the bass player until he hits a wrong note, and then it's super noticeable and everybody looks at you. Some of the gear that I use when I'm playing, I'm not a big pedal guy. I typically will just run into a DI, a direct box. A couple different ones I've used over the years. This is a Sans amp. Which gives you a little more flexibility as far as EQ, drive, that type of stuff. I've moved away from that, and now I typically just use, this is called a Neve RNDI. It's just a really nice direct box. They're not particularly cheap, but it's been my favorite one recently. Obviously, everybody's got their own favorite direct box, but that's kind of my one piece of personal gear between the bass and what the sound engineer is getting. As far as basses that I'm playing, I am typically playing either a Fender Jazz bass or a Fender Precision bass. I find when I'm recording, I go to a Precision bass 99% of the time. This is a Precision bass, by the way. You can see the difference in the pickups. This has the two here. This just has the one centrally located. The Precision bass has just a real warmth to it that mixes really well in a recording, and it's easy to mix. I find live, I kind of like the punchiness of a jazz bass. It kind of has a little bit more mid-range punch that will cut through. And then obviously there's all kinds of different basses out there. Sometimes I'll have fun and play like a little short scale, like this is a 1970s Univox. If I'm feeling like I want to play striper music or something, I'll pick up a 1980s PVT 40, but this is the heaviest bass known to man, so I don't play that very much. Typically I'm sticking with my J basses or the P bass. Every once in a while I'll have fun. We usually break it down for a little acoustic set, and we'll pull out this little, it's called a ukulele bass. This is a fretless right here. I'll let you hear just a second of it. So that gives you a really kind of a thumpy, almost rubbery sound. I wouldn't say it's like the upright bass, but it is a similar sonic characteristic to it. One of the very important things when playing the bass is to keep your nails very short. I'm usually clipping them as close to my fingers as I can get them, which is a little bit frustrating because I'm also a guitar player and I like longer nails for that. Other thing that's important when you're starting out is knowing how to hold the bass. For me, the easiest and most natural way I've found is instead of keeping it directly in line with my body like this, I'm typically rotating out almost at a 45-degree angle. If I think of a circle around my body, I'm going to rotate out a few degrees this way, and it just feels a little more natural for the arm. That way I'm not kind of getting cramped against my body if I'm playing up high. One of the next basic things I would say, is to practice with a metronome. When you're playing with a band, you've got to stay with that metronome and that click which the drummer is following. The other thing that I find really handy, I have a little a headphone practice amp is what they call it, and it just plugs in to the 1/4-inch output, and they're really cheap, maybe about $40. Plugs in and lets you plug in a pair of headphones. You can also plug your phone into it and play music into it so that you can play along with music in your headphones, because quite frankly, bass is one of those instruments that really carries through the walls and over long distances, and your neighbors will be very thankful, and your family too, probably, if you're not blasting your amp. Speaking of amps, I don't typically tour with an amp anymore. We usually have enough subwoofers near the stage that I can feel it well enough. That being the case, if I am playing with an amp, I'll usually go with a Ampeg SVT Classic, the 300 watt tube amp, and then an 810 cabinet. So yeah, go big or go home. So now let's get into just the nuts and bolts of sort of the initial aspects of the technique of playing the bass. What we want to do is we want to think about this hand right here. Essentially, the hand that is the plucking hand, the hand that is plucking the strings, is your most important. Think of it as the heart that is going to pump the blood to the rest of the feel of the song. Without this, you're not doing much with that left hand other than fretting. And I think one of the things coming from playing guitar to start with is you're thinking about that left hand, that fretting hand, as being so important, because that's the one where you're doing all your scales and you want to be fast with that hand and shred. But with bass, it's really this hand and these two fingers. Some people use 3, 2 is the most common, and then you've got some strange guys like James Jamerson, I think it was, that used 1. So that hand is going to give you all the feel. Now, it's important that we get the technique of this hand down before anything else. And I think one of the most important things to start with is to get to where you can play with these two fingers and have them sound exactly the same as each other. If I'm playing with my index or my middle finger, I want to be able to pluck it exactly the same, so that when I'm doing this, there's not a tonal difference between the two for the most part. So once you can do an even rhythm with those fingers, then you can start practicing crossing strings. Now, one of the most important things once you start crossing strings is you have to start muting the lower strings as you go up higher. If I'm doing this, notes, it happens especially as you're going down lower on the strings. So you hear how they start ringing out, and it just creates a muddy sound. So there's a couple techniques that are used for muting those strings so that they're not all starting to bleed at the same time. Some people will use their pinky. I believe Jaco Pastorius was one of the ones who used that technique, and he used his pinky to sort of mute the strings on this back side here as he was playing notes. To me, that always felt super unnatural. I could not figure out how to do that. So I always use my thumb, and I would say probably 90% of bass players do that. When they cross over to a string, you'll notice how this thumb will move. And I'm resting that thumb, keeping that thumb against these upper strings so that they can't ring out as I'm playing this note. Otherwise, you're going to get all these low notes that start ringing out on top. If I keep that thumb there, it keeps them all muted. I usually will rest this part of my arm on there, and that becomes an anchor point. And then my thumb also becomes an anchor point. I used to rest the back of my wrist here on the bass, but I found that that was sort of constricting. There are bass players that do that though. One of the other things that's so much fun about bass is you have so much tonal range and dynamic range just by the way you can play. You can play with more of the tips of your fingers, almost pulling up on the string. You can press down on it and get more of a popping sound. The other thing is, depending on where you're playing and whether you're closer to the bridge here or closer to the neck, that can change your tone incredibly. So 99% of the time I'm playing here over my kind of my middle pickup or central pickup. But if you want to get more of a warmer tone, you can move up here over the neck, get close to the neck, and it really warms up the tone. Also, moving back to the bridge gives you a much punchier kind of tone, and you get almost more of that Jaco Pastorius kind of. Obviously, he had a fretless bass, so it sounds a little bit different, but you can see how that gives you that real sort of punchy soloing type of tone, which is not particularly useful in most of the music I play. I'm usually split between the two pickups evenly, or with a P bass, then it's just all one pickup and tone. When you start playing with a band, one of the most important things is to lock in with your drummer's kick drum. The kick is really that is the punch that drives the song, and when the bass and the kick drum are locked together or complementing each other, it really makes the band sound tight no matter what everybody else is doing. So I am always listening to my drummer to see, okay, where is he putting his kick? Is it, doom, 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 ga. So I'm always listening to try to groove along with him. Whatever beat he's doing, I'm trying to follow him. And likewise, he's listening to me. Am I adding in little ghost notes? Maybe he's going to match those. So let's talk briefly about ghost notes. Ghost notes are super fun on the bass. When I say ghost note, it's what I'm referring to is basically a note that's almost muted, and it's like a passing tone. A great example would be Paul Simon's Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes, which is one of my favorite bass lines. But Keithy, the bass player who played that, incredible bass player, he played a fretless bass, but the ghost notes that he used in that opening riff of the song. One of my favorite bass lines of all time. I don't do it justice, but imagine if he had not put all those ghost notes in there. It would just be. He's also using that kind of technique where he's pushing down hard on the string, so it's creating a little pop against the fret up here. Another thing that I should talk about is raking the strings. When I'm doing scales, I used to always try to alternate, which is the proper technique when going up a scale. I'm alternating fingers every other. Now when I'm coming back down though, I learned a technique called raking the strings, and what I'm doing is, if you'll notice, when I'm coming down, when I end on that index finger is already on the next string, ready to play that note. And so instead of alternating and playing it with my middle finger, I'll just go ahead and play it with that, and that's called raking. It makes it so easy when you're descending a scale. It feels sort of like falling off a cliff. It's that easy. A few other just little fun techniques that I'll use every once in a while is harmonics. Usually this is if we're playing in the key of like E minor or G major. There's really nice harmonics on the bass for that, and I'll just use it super sparingly. But you can see we're in the key of G here. If you have ever heard Victor Wooten's solo Amazing Grace on the bass, he does an amazing harmonic solo where I can't remember how it goes. So that's fun to use as just, if you're trying to show off, I guess. Every once in a while, I'll use that in tandem with like a volume swell into something. It just gives kind of a really pretty tone to end a song or begin a song with a fade in like that. I should talk about the number system. If you're studying music, you probably already know this. But some people call it figured bass. When I moved to Nashville, they started calling it they call it the Nashville number system, because I'm sure they think they invented it. So that every note of the scale has a number, and essentially the key that you're in becomes your number one. So if I'm in the key of C, then C is my 1, then D would be my 2, and E would be my 3, F would be 4, anyway, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. That's another really handy technique if you're playing live with a band and you're suddenly throwing the guys a song that they've never heard before and they don't know. Because I can throw up hand signals. We've got a couple new players in our band, and somebody requests a song that maybe we wrote 10 years ago and they don't know. I can throw up, hey, it's 1, 4, 5, 6, pinky is your 6, and then 2, that would be 7. And thankfully these guys are good enough that they can just run with it like that. But a fun little riff that I use in a song called Higher, I'll do like a flat 7 and a 3 and a 1. So the song in A minor, and I can slide up. So there's my flat 7, there's the 3, there's the 1, back of the A. Anyway, so that's kind of getting into modes, which I'm not going to talk about in this video, but in that same song, Higher, that we have, I also use a lot of slides. Slides are a great way to add dynamic to a song. So when the chorus hits, I go down and it's kind of a so I'm listening to the drums and I'm hearing it's got that kind of big so how can I accent that kick and that snare that my drummer is doing? I slide between the notes, so I slide up the octave. Anyway, so sliding is a great technique. It can also be used sort of to transition between different parts of the song. Big slide like that often is used going into like a big chorus or something to really make that chorus just sort of like an 808 drop. Now let's talk about palm muting. This is one of my favorite techniques. Coming from guitar and learning to play with a pick, I sort of developed on the bass, being able to play, essentially imitating that with my thumb and forefinger. And what that allows me to do is then I can use this fleshy part of my hand and mute just above the bridge on the strings here. And that allows me to get this real kind of like thumpy, short, rather than a note that's going to sustain. So that's a really fun technique to use on certain kind of songs. That we have a sort of a real groovy song called Human Condition, and it has this bass line. The chord progression is B minor, A minor, E minor, and so my bass line in that, the drums are kind of, so, and then I'm doing sort of a reverse arpeggio down on that. But you can see how the palm muting allows me to get that real kind of short, instead of, it's just a totally different sound. And finally, what every bass player wants to learn, but what they should not learn until they have mastered everything else first, especially get this hand figured out first with the plucking, before you ever start slapping the bass. I know you want to slap right away, but I'll just briefly talk about it. There's a couple different ways of going about it. The way I initially learned, and actually I'm going to switch over to my jazz bass because slapping on a P bass does not sound good. Okay, well there's the bounce technique, where basically you're bouncing this part of your thumb off of the string, sort of right at the neck joint here. Now there's also people that slap, and instead of bouncing off the string, they basically go through the string, and so they end up on the other side. Now the thing that's really cool about that is it allows you to go through the string and then pluck back up with that thumb. That's a technique that I haven't really mastered very well. Bass players like Victor Wooten use that a ton. Their thumb almost becomes a pick. And I think my battery is actually dying in that bass. Then there's the pop of that part. And that's essentially you're using these fingers to just pluck the string up. A fun thing to do with that is to use, you can almost use all three of your fingers and create like a triplet. So I'm plucking with thumb, index, and my middle finger. So it becomes that type of thing. The other big part of slapping is this hand. This becomes part of the slapping technique, really, in that it becomes another percussive element. So you notice I'm hammering on. So that's sort of the basics of slapping, and you put it all together, the slap, the pluck, and then this hand doing the hammer on or muting slap, and you kind of get this thing. Anyway, it's fun. Slapping isn't something I do very often, but you know, it will impress a crowd. So remember, lock in with your drummer and practice that right hand technique or the plucking hand technique. Get that down. It was great hanging out with y'all, and I hope you keep rocking the bass.
I used to carry a heavy prison of steel. I had a closet of dusty bones to conceal. Traveling with so much baggage, it took all I